Yeah, these are my copies. It has the arc.
Yeah, I just brought those over because I want to use them as a prop.
Oh yeah, yeah. Those are newer and they don't have that. This is how I know I don't leave the crappy copies with people. Not crappy, but the worn. Yeah, it's been interesting. Ready? Oh.
Geenawateel, take one, scene one. Well, welcome and thank you for joining us at Scuttlebutt Lodge. Today I'm welcomed and privileged to have Geenawateel, the author of this, an explosive look into the con, and it's called Fistman's Fraud. So most people in Ontario will know the name Fistman. Others might not. He was a hand-selected expert on the Ontario Science Table, a tenured professor at the University of Toronto, who was engaged in social media and many other places promoting the counterfeit virus and the outrageous and preposterous mandates. So Gina is from Ottawa. She has published not only the book Fistman's Fraud, but also an appendix as well of various letters. And welcome to Scuttlebutt Lodge.
Thanks for the invite, Randy.
And for anybody else, just to let you know, this is one of the ways that I help fund my legal defense. If anybody wants to rent the cabin, go to nomorelelockdowns.ca, and there's you'll see the pictures and the images of the cabin. And if you want to enjoy some freedom-minded people and spend a night or two in a 200-year-old restored log cabin, come on down to Scuttlebutt Lodge. So first off, Gina, you're not a well-known author until November of 2023. You hadn't written any other books?
No.
No. You're a mom in Ottawa, and sometime during the last 4 years, your eyes were opened during the COVID pandemic.
Yes, I'm very fortunate that my eyes were never closed, right. So it's played out. You could see things coming from far away.
So one of the interesting things that first off, is Fistman's Fraud. And just for people in the audience, typically our legal system is used as a weapon to go after people. And whenever you use the word fraud in conjunction with somebody else's name, that generally opens you up to a civil defamation suit. But you've not had any threatening legal letters. David Fistman has not jumped up and down in the courtroom saying this is defamatory.
No, I've heard really nothing from that, apart from a couple snarky tweets that other people told me about, because he has blocked me. But no, I haven't heard anything. Nobody has come forward and mentioned anything about a libel suit or anything.
So one might logically deduce from that, he also knows it's a fraud and hasn't done anything to challenge your statements.
Yes, they basically Fistman and two of his colleagues, basically engaged in a textbook definition of scientific fraud. So it would be pretty much impossible for them not to know that they did it.
So before we get into some of the meat and potatoes of the fraud, or the con, I prefer to call it the con job, but it is, the con job is a colloquial term. Fraud is an actual, it's a criminal offense.
Well, there's criminal fraud, and I speak specifically, though, of scientific fraud. So when I look at it, scientific fraud has a specific definition, and what they did in their study satisfies that.
Yes. So criminal fraud is when you use false pretenses to induce someone to do something. That's what a criminal fraud is.
Right. Now, scientifically...
But scientific fraud is slightly different.
Yes. So
there is not the inducing others to engage in some activity.
Right. So with scientific fraud, what the authors do is they've engaged in the fabrication and falsification of data and results.
Yeah.
So with fabrication of data, it's when you make up data or results and then you pass them off as true or a true reflection of reality. Whereas falsification, they've engaged in falsification when they omit observations because it doesn't give them what they want. So in their case, they omitted real world data from the official Government of Ontario website, which is well known, and they knew it existed. And many of us scientists went back and said, hey, your stuff is opposite of what the real world data says, and they failed to correct the record, and they failed to use that information. So they did both falsification and fabrication of data and results.
Why I make that, because when you read through and you see there was the scientific fraud.
Yes.
And you've got that very well laid out, and that hasn't been challenged. But part of what Fishman was also doing, it appears to me, is that he was using his scientific fraud to also induce others to do things, such as the closure of schools, the promoting that it was unsafe for schools to be open, that people needed to wear masks. Yeah, there was this, but we'll get into some of the other things that he was trying to get people to do.
So with this particular scientific fraud, it involved the trying to coerce people into taking the vaccine, right? But also using the results to advocate for vaccine passports, mandates, and travel restrictions. Yeah. So basically using false results to punish individuals. Yeah. So then it gets very vilifying, punish them, because he also comes out and blames them for a lot of things.
Yeah.
So there's the blame that they are an increased risk to others, and also
an increased risk to the vaccinated. That he was a big promoter of that narrative as well.
Well, that is the narrative.
Yeah.
He basically what my book does is it shows that pandemic of the unvaccinated was a political narrative, and it was a fraudulent one. Yeah. And so he was big with that one. So
we'll put that on the table for a moment.
Okay.
So what about knowing who David Fishman actually is? And what's your sense of who that man is, and what is his nature, and what is his character, what is his attributes, but also why? So in all of this, in all of your communications with the University of Toronto, with Doug Ford, with the OPP, with the various academic bodies, did you get a sense of who this David Fishman actually is and what drives him?
Well, when I look at how, I don't want to say how he's been used, but what he's done through the pandemic, I look at him as Canada's front man for pandemic modeling. So that's who he seems to be to me.
The UK's Ferguson.
Yeah. Yeah. So yes, UK had its Ferguson, and we have our Fishman.
Right.
And
beware of people with the last name who starts with F. I guess. Because there's another one. I think his name was Fauci. Also.
Yeah, actually, that's true. Yeah, so he did a lot. Like you said, he was a very strong proponent for lockdowns, school closures, went against the reopening of schools, was big into masking, and then, of course, with the vaccine mandates.
But he is a tenured professor at University of Toronto.
Yes.
He has reached or nearing the pinnacle of academic recognition. And so typically one would say that otherwise normal, intelligent human beings don't engage in fraudulent behavior, dishonest behavior. So why Fissman? What did you get any sense? Why was he knowingly and intentionally creating scientific fraud?
So I don't attempt to come up with why he would do that in terms of his character. I just look at what he did, when he did it, and how he did it.
Yeah.
And so I can establish, like when you go through, there was a lot of conflicts of interest. Mm-hmm. So this is very apparent, and it's not hard to see. If you just do a really quick search, you see that he has a lot of connections to pharmaceutical companies, but he also is, very influential with all levels of government, from municipal to provincial to federal, and he has international reach. So he's a very connected fellow, with a lot of conflicts of interest.
Well, that helps climb up the ladder in the hierarchy of academia, is by feel well connected.
And he is a tenured professor at the University of Toronto, but he is also a physician. Yeah. So there is an obligation there as an
actual practicing clinical physician
in internal medicine. So there's that component as well. So there's an obligation there in terms of how he should be conducting himself. So it goes beyond just a mathematical modeler. Yeah. All right. He came into the picture very early on. Before the pandemic was even called, he had been granted federal funds to do the modeling. Mm-hmm. So that was like February of 2020. Right. And then a few months later, he was already in front of a House of Commons committee talking about his modeling and how to proceed. So he was
even before the counterfeit pandemic arrived, he was on the stage promoting the dangers and promoting his view of what may happen with modeling or
he basically he was prone to hyperbole and exaggeration, and this became clear very early on. Right. And it was, to me, it was pretty problematic, especially when he talked about school closures and was against it, because that's, the virus was never, COVID-19 was never a serious risk for young children. No. It never was. Never. No. So for him to advocate for school closures, which would harm kids.
So he got in on the ground floor, or even maybe a little earlier than most on the ground floor of the pandemic, using his connections, being in front of the House of Commons, being in front of committees. And then, of course, obviously, he gets named to the Ontario Science Table as well, which was a collection. There was a whole bunch of them, and it was very difficult. I was in elected office at that time. It was very difficult to find out actually how many science tables there were, what they were doing, who was on them, and how influential or not they were in the political. It was very opaque in the early days.
Right. So with me, so much happened during the pandemic that I really hadn't even thought of David Fissman until this study came out. And then it was just so outrageous. That's when I turned my attention. I'm like, how did he get this? And what has he been doing? And then I was...
Is that the April study?
That's April of 2022. Right. So it was just, at that time, it was past the Omicron. The Omicron wave had happened over Christmas, and in January we had the trucker convoy. We had the provinces had relented on their vaccine passports, and there's pressure on the federal government to relent on its mandates and travel restrictions, right? And there was absolutely no justification for them. Yeah. And then Fissman comes out with his study, basically saying that the unvaccinated posed a risk to the vaccinated, and that they had higher rates of COVID than the vaccinated, when I knew that was not the case. Yeah. And so when I looked at his modeling, I just reading it right off the. It was so blatantly obvious that it was wrong, it was fraudulent, and opposite of the data, because I was very well aware of what the data actually said.
So that was the modeling about how the unvaccinated posed this great danger to the vaccinated.
Yes.
But he did the modeling in the early days as well,
yes.
about how people were going to be dropping like flies,
including a tsunami of death.
Well, that was
that was his. We're going to have a tsunami of death if you reopen the schools. It's like, what are you talking about?
Right.
And a lot of his predictions did not come to pass, and then his models were shown to be exaggerations. So,
well, we know that in the first year of COVID, the average age of death in Canada attributed to COVID. And attributed is the proper word because it's but was 83.6 years of age. It was the average death in the first year of COVID. And just as a side story, for the first time in my life, I saw something that I had never seen during the pandemic, and that was a funeral home close up due to lack of business. Right here in the town of Perth, funeral homes, as a rule, are fairly high margin, profitable businesses. And I had never ever seen one close up. I'd seen them bought and merged and acquired by others and getting bigger. But I've never seen one actually close up and not be able to sell the business.
When was that?
That was in the summer of 2020.
Oh.
O'Daker Funeral Home here in Perth shuttered its doors. So this was one of those again. Unlike the videos, the CIA fabricated videos of Chinese people falling flat on their face and dying, foaming at the mouth in the early days of COVID. Here, which nobody here in Canada ever saw anybody falling flat on their face, foaming at the mouth of COVID. But we did see. For the first time, a funeral home closed up because, and that was just how can a funeral home not be exceptionally profitable during a pandemic? It's a question that I've not been able to answer. So you didn't really get a good sense of what this guy's values are, or what was driving him.
You can get a sense of the values in how he conducts himself, right? So when you go, for example, on his social media, it's quite shocking, because as a professional, as a physician and a tenured professor, you would think you would conduct yourself, better, because you professionally, because it reflects poorly on yourself and your profession and the university. Yeah. So when you go around and you insult people and you call them anti-vaxxers and you make comparisons to try to make people look stupid and you're derogatory that way, it reflects very poorly. Yeah. And then also when you look at what he writes in his papers, there's extreme bias in his papers, just in the way he talks and the tone. So you do get a sense when you look at that. And then also the derogatory comparisons. You don't do that in a scientific journal, in a scientific paper.
No, I watched him a fair bit, and the term arrogance would certainly be applicable to David Fishman. Like, he thought he was, there wasn't many that were as smart as David Fishman, according to David Fishman.
Which is shocking when you look at the papers that he produces, because they're it's not just fraudulent, they're just shockingly bad from a scientific perspective. It's surprising to me, even if the fraud wasn't there, that a tenured professor would produce such poor studies.
I guess he never read that commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness. He doesn't subscribe to that commandment, Mr. Fishman. But the other thing that is, I think, is what I saw with Fishman and with others, like this was like utopia for public health academics. They were always in the closets and in the shadows. Nobody paid any attention to David Fisman's or any of them. I forget, nobody knew who the public chief medical officer of health was in Ontario before COVID. Nobody knew any of these. And there's hundreds and thousands of them scattered throughout the universities, throughout the land. Now they became not only recognizable figures and important figures, they were being called upon. The media were couldn't get to these people fast enough to get their comment on the latest thing.
Right.
Their stature went from down here to up here in the public view, and now they viewed themselves as very, very important people, and that's what it seemed like to me. They lost sight, if they ever had it in the first place, and I think a lot of them never had it in the first place, but they lost sight of their purpose as public health academics and saw themselves now in this starring role of importance. And their egos were fed, and nobody ever challenged them. They were in great demand. Nobody ever challenged what they said.
Right. I'm not sure with David Fisman, though, because when I look at how he came up on the scene in February, March 2020 already, and then in the House of Commons especially, when he talked then, there was one individual, Dr. Shabas, who spoke in a very common sense manner and was warning of the danger of just focusing on COVID and the danger of shutting down schools and going that route. Mm-hmm. And he did go against those measures knowing they would be harmful. And he even said at that time, if you just keep going with this testing and this focus on transmission and lockdowns, you will ultimately fail. That's not going to work. And he was proven right. Yeah. But at that time, with Fisman, he went against what Shabas was saying, and he was very insulting to that at that point. So
Fisman was insulting to Shabas.
Yes, he was. Yeah. So sorry, Fisman was insulting. Let me get that right. Fisman was insulting to Shabas, and the thing is that's early on. Yeah. So early on, he already seemed to have that attitude, and he was not really open to the truth. Yeah. Early on. Yeah,
there was one other medical officer of health in Montreal, Dr. Lawrence Rosenberg, who came out and said, essentially that the pandemic wasn't that big. It wasn't, that COVID was much like the flu.
Right.
That was the peak of heresy and blasphemy is to compare COVID to the flu, even though that's what it was. But both Shabas and Rosenberg were, put in the yoke in the public square and suffered the pillory of from people like Fisman and
right.
others.
But when you look at how the politicians behaved, and if you look at the exchange in the House, I think it's May 2020, you can see that Fisman was providing the narrative that they wanted. Yeah. And so they made that choice to go with his kind of, fake science and false modeling, and to ignore anyone who said anything different, even if the evidence was on the side of not doing what they wanted. So they made that conscious choice. Yeah. And there was a lot of scientists that were against what happened. This whole consensus science, that is also a fabrication, a political fabrication. There was no consensus. The scientists would not, there would be no consensus to do the wrong thing, and that's what happened. The wrong thing was done. So to say that all scientists jumped on board of doing the exact wrong thing is absurd.
Well, I guess, and you can see this in your book, and you can see it elsewhere, and you mentioned it already, the conflicts of interest. And just, Fisman, had paid gigs and was well connected with Pfizer and Moderna, various pharma items. He had collected money and had provided advice to them on a host of subjects. He was being paid by the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, and they were wanting to keep the schools closed, because why not? Why would you want your teachers teaching in a school when you could have them sitting at home collecting the same money? And so he was on the payroll for Elementary Teachers Federation, and they themselves also have other entanglements with, as you point out in the book, the WEF and various global entities and pharma and tech through their pension funds and
right. I don't actually get into the WEF and that in the book, though.
Yeah. Well,
just to so people don't go looking for
well, you'd have to have a multi-volume set to go through in detail all of the entanglements that these people have and all the conflicts of interest.
Well, there are many.
Yeah. And David Fishman is, of course, not the only one. And we saw that very clearly. This came out during COVID about how Fauci's position and his authority to disperse funding, billions and billions of dollars of funding through various academic institutions and scientific institutions, would put him in a position of a godlike position that, he's funding our research project. So I'm not going to say anything nasty about Mr. Fauci, because my funding is going to possibly be revoked. So if Fauci says it's a dangerous pandemic, it must be a dangerous pandemic. And, and we see the same. This is nothing new. This is human nature. We've seen it with our mainstream media. The federal government and our provincial governments subsidize their content production. They subsidize their salaries. They are one of the biggest advertising revenue sources for media. So is the media going to not go along with, are they going to bite the hand that's feeding them?
Right. So with what you're saying, there seems to be, there's a lot of push in terms of what the federal government wanted. Mm-hmm. So where Fisman comes in depends on, you're not going to say Fisman was guiding them or they were guiding Fisman, right? That's what it comes down to.
Yeah, I don't, I think, my view of the provincial premiers are, many of them were manipulated.
Provincially?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think Trudeau was very manipulated. I think he saw this as a beneficial. I think he probably knew of entanglements with the Public Health Agency of Canada, with the Wuhan lab and the Winnipeg lab, and the entanglements with Fauci's gain of function, offshoring shenanigans.
There's really no doubt in my mind that Trudeau saw this as a huge opportunity, and they've come out and said what an opportunity it was several times. Even Chrystia Freeland, this is a great opportunity, and and they really, and you can see that with all the actions. It's consistent with.
And he, compared to any other political leader in the country, I don't think anybody used as horrendous, reprehensible language to describe those who were opposed to the COVID pandemic or opposed to the mandates.
Well, it was not only offensive, it was abrasive, and it's basically hate speech what he was saying when he comes out, and that's the issue when you look at how he spoke, especially during the campaign. it's shocking.
Yeah.
Because he knew when he called that election, it was well known that these vaccines did not stop transmission. And not just they did not stop transmission, there was huge outbreaks amongst mostly vaccinated venues. And then Israel was also having a resurgence in theirs, and they were onto their third dose already. So it was known. And then he calls this election, and the language that he uses, first with him and the premiers, they've created an identifiable group. And then they vilify that group, and then they do everything in their power to punish that group. So this goes beyond hate speech.
Oh, without a doubt. I think, the actions of Trudeau, well, they can't be excused in any fashion. The words and it was just reprehensible that he was describing the people that he is supposed to be leading, the people who he is supposed to be representing, as in the way that he did. I just make that contrast with some of the other provincial premiers. The worst I heard Doug Ford say, and I'm not making excuses for Doug Ford. I know him, and him and I don't get along very well. But let's be fair. He would refer to me and to others like me as yahoos. He didn't get into the it's derogatory. It's and it's also a little juvenile. But he didn't get into the vitriol like Trudeau did.
Well, and that's just it. The vitriol. When you take a really close look at what Trudeau was saying and how he was saying it, when I look at him saying these things, it came off as very vindictive and hateful. I didn't see fear.
No.
I did not see fear. It didn't look to me like it was driven by fear. He looked angry and hateful, like the things he was saying, and it didn't make any sense. You would not compare not getting an experimental jab. What does that have to do with, misogyny, racism? Like, these are ridiculous. Like, how can you just say these things, right? Anti-vaxxers, knowing that most people, that he was talking about, had their vaccines, had a lot of their childhood vaccines. It's just, this was not a childhood vaccine. This was an experimental jab. So it is shocking that he was able to say that, and that the media not only didn't really call him out on it, but then they ran headlines with the same thing.
They were applauding. Everybody will remember that front page of the Toronto Star.
You can't forget it.
Let
them die?
Let them die. The unvaccinated were not just yahoos. These people were threatening the livelihoods and the lives of the vaccinated. They were dangerous. They were posing an imminent, lethal danger to everybody else in society if they were not cloistered in their rooms, in their homes. That we couldn't allow them to be on a bus or a train, or we couldn't allow them to be in a restaurant or to travel or to go see a hockey game. These people were the scourge.
Right, and the thing is that they knew, and their top experts had to have known that was untrue. But what they were saying is they were basically vilifying individuals. And how do they think that factors in terms of the danger to the individuals they're vilifying? I mean, people, hated the unvaccinated because of what these guys were saying. And everybody felt justified in doing whatever to, the mean-spiritedness that went into this was awful. And for the kids in particular, it was horrific. And then with our family, when I look at my children and what they took from my children, I just can't accept that as a mother, that you would threaten their education, that you would threaten, their sports, that you would threaten their friendships. I mean, was cruel.
Yeah.
It was cruel what they did.
Yeah. Well, this is where, we'll try to broach this in a way that the censors will not take offense at. But, we have seen this played out in history, where we have seen a government using a false narrative, using fabricated evidence, and using hyperbolic, vitriolic language to create an enemy within their nation.
Right.
It's happened in the past, and with horrendous consequences for those people who were labeled
right.
as the scourge, as the danger, as the unclean, as the contaminants within society. But we did it.
Yes, and so when you look at my book, it's called Fisman's Fraud, The Rise of Canadian Hate Science.
Yep.
And that's what went on. It was hate science.
Yep.
So it's interesting because Trudeau, through the whole thing, kept saying, follow the science. Well, the actual science, the natural science that we all think of when we think of science, was saying basically the opposite of what the government was saying. And that was true from the beginning. Like when you mentioned earlier, like, sometime over the past 4 years when I caught on to what was going on, well, I looked at the data right away in March of 2020. It's the first thing I did when they called the pandemic, they were going to lock us down. I got worried. I thought, oh my God, how bad is this? I better check it out because I can be an overprotective mother. Yeah. So the first thing I did is fire up that laptop, look at the data, and think, oh, we'll be fine. Like, I was relieved. And I am like an overprotective parent. And I'm looking, thinking, oh, the kids will be fine. Most working aged adults will be fine who are healthy. We should just concentrate on the elderly, those with comorbid conditions. It was pretty obvious that resources should have went to, hospitals, long-term care home, and that type of thing. So right away, I was shocked that the government was doing pretty much opposite. There's no reason to lock down everybody and to shut down the economy. No reason at all to shut down the schools. So that was very, very worrisome. So
what you're saying there just reminded, so you looked at it from a data scientific view and came up with their 2 + 2 is telling us that it equals 5, where it doesn't. You're looking at the data and saying the actual science says this is not a big deal. This is not it's being highly exaggerated and being described in ways that the science doesn't support, first off.
I was looking at that, and I was also looking at it from a risk mitigation, right? Because I'm, I care about society, I care about my family. I wanted to minimize risk, right? So that's how I was looking at it. I was looking at it, and I used to do a lot of risk analysis. So I said, okay, what strategy should we be doing as a family and in general to minimize risk and make sure everybody's going to be okay? And then when I looked at it, I thought, oh, okay, I will give my parents a call. They should lay low and that type of thing. I'll talk to my siblings in healthcare because they'll be front line. And the rest of us, I was telling my kids, go out and play and have a good time because it's not really a threat to you. And so nobody in my household was ever worried about the virus and COVID. No one. And actually,
Well, I want to contrast that. Initially, I was more concerned that the cure, the mandates, were obviously causing far more harm than COVID was. That, as an elected representative, I was hearing endlessly all day long, every day, from constituents who were just in a absolute, utter dark place, in despair, in anxiety, not knowing if they were going to have food on the table, if they were going to have work, if they were going to lose their home, if it was going to be foreclosed. Like, it was just and the hatred that was developing with the 1-800 snitch lines that we had created, and encouraging hatred amongst our neighbors and family members and stuff. So, and of course, so it was my experience that first off, the solution is causing more harm. The second was the observations that, okay, well, and to this day, I don't know of anybody who died from COVID.
Yeah, I don't either.
I know many people who have died prematurely in the last 2 years, but they were all fortunately vaccinated. And I say that obviously with some, we don't want to see, and I don't want to see people die prematurely. But I've seen far more death in the last 2 years than in the first 2 years of COVID. But then for me, was the icing on the cake for me, knowing that this was a con, was when the Diamond Princess docked in Florida. To me, that was just, okay.
Guys.
The game, here we have the perfect, or is near perfect, laboratory experiment to know how dangerous this pandemic is. A ship with thousands of people on it, quarantined. There's no variables involved. They're all at sea. And they ended up with the same death rate that every cruise has. Before pre-pandemic times. Like typically on a cruise ship of that size, there's on average 1 death per week.
Okay.
Yeah. So by the time the Diamond Princess disembarked, there was 9 people that had died. None of the crew. It was the more elderly passengers that died.
Right.
That's typically who goes on cruises, or more elderly, and often have chronic or underlying health conditions. And that's why cruise ships of that size have a mortuary on
I
deck.
did not know that.
So
I haven't been on a cruise though. But,
well, I've never been on a cruise ship yet. I'm still waiting until I get older, older and with chronic injury, chronic health problems. But but that's where once again all context was removed on everything. That you were not allowed to contrast the deaths during 2020 with the deaths in 2019 from influenza. You weren't allowed.
You weren't allowed to do those comparisons.
No. So context was completely removed, and even there's so many exaggerations in the PCR test.
See, now you're getting into other things, right? Like when I was looking at it, so the thing that it was obvious right away was the unreliable statistics that they were using and the manipulation of data. Yeah. So I looked at it and it's like, what are you doing? You can play with the numbers however you want, right? You can, you need more people to get COVID, just test more, up the cycle threshold, like there's so many ways to play with it, and and it changed across time. So you have unreliable performance metrics here, right? When I was looking just initially when they locked everything down and they were talking about the infection fatality rate, one of the things, I did with my husband, we're watching like YouTube videos and I said to him, hey, what do you think the infection fatality rate is? You do your calculation, I'll do my calculation, we'll flip and we'll see how close we are to it. Right? And we did that. And both of us was very similar. We thought it was around 0.1%. Yeah. Meanwhile, you had them saying, oh, it's 3.2% CDC. Yeah. And it's like, no, you knew that was off by over an order of magnitude. You knew it back then, right?
So you also knew it was because I remember it was either late August or early September 2020. The deputy chief medical officer of health in Ontario at the time, Barbara Yaffe, was on CTV News doing a scrum, and she told everyone that the PCR test would have upwards or more than 50% false positives. Right? That was
when?
That was late August or early September 2020.
2020.
2020, the PCR test was 50% false positives. And I raised this question in the House in Queen's Park. But so if you're measuring the infection fatality rate against an infection figure that is known to be 50% or more false positives, okay, you can't have a valid infection fatality rate based on a 50% false number.
Right.
But, and nobody in the press challenged her on this. Nobody in the media or nobody in politics challenged this statement. And, and she quietly never said that again.
Right. But with me, what I did was when I looked at the data, I looked at all the early data coming in the curves, right? From not just Canada, but, the worldwide data. And you can see how at that time, you knew sort of who they were testing. They were limiting it to more of the serious cases, symptomatic. They said about 80% of the cases were not severe symptoms and they weren't getting tested, that kind of thing. And it was kind of prior to all the manipulations, and you could actually get a lot of information at that time. So it was that early data I was able to do a rough calculation of infection fatality rate, right? So at that time, I had kind of thought, well, I think it's going to be between 0.1 and 0.3%. And it's because I knew that they weren't testing everybody. So there was an undercount at that time. And that there was a lag time for the testing to come back positive and another lag time for the deaths. So I was able to take that into account. As the months went on and they played more with the data and played more with the cycle thresholds and that, then it's like, okay, I can't use that anymore. So then I didn't. So I could do a lot more just on my own, looking at the beginning.
Yeah.
And that's when they were saying, oh, it's too early and we don't know. And I'm like, actually, we know quite a bit. We know quite a bit. And it was interesting because it took the CDC several months, and then finally they were coming down to where my estimate was back, in the beginning.
Yeah. So I guess we could say, listening to that, is that in the most uncertain time was the most reliable evidence.
Well, the thing is, we knew a lot more than they were saying.
Yeah, but we also saw that the skewing and the manipulation of data became ever more prevalent, ever more prominent.
It did.
As time went on and became less, that's when we found out, things like, well, yeah, the COVID is on the death certificate, but we were not going to talk about the diabetes, the heart attack, the blood pressure,
right.
The obesity,
right.
or any of the other stuff. Like, we were not going to talk about the car accident or the motorcycle accident that...
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, because we also knew really early on that well over 90% of the individuals had comorbid conditions, right? So it's that whole, they died with COVID, not because of COVID, which then they shouldn't have been calling it COVID death because, you're implying it is because of COVID. Yeah. And they use it that way when they talk to people, right?
Well, again, remove the context, remove any other evidence. But I did want to get so your journey also took you to the OPP, and I want to bring this up because my journey took me to the OPP as well, or even in a few different fashions. But your journey took you to the OPP and a letter and a request. So what was...
Right. Okay, so when I looked at Fisman's fraud, it struck me different than the other things. So I could tell early on there was manipulation of data, there was manipulation of the statistics, a lot of false modeling they were using, okay? And they kept waving their hands as to why that was okay. But I'm telling you, like, from a statistical point of view, that these are very simple tricks. All right. So they weren't fooling me, and it seemed like they were using it to fool, the population. And another thing, so that was, the issue is proving intent, right?
Yeah.
So then you have, somebody at the door.
Yeah.
So improving intent, right? So when I looked at Fisman's work, it struck me because he actually fabricated the data and the results, and he tried to pass it off as true. So there is intent there. You can't make up data, pass it off as true, and not know you're doing it. And also, we all told him. Like a lot not all, but like a lot of dozens of scientists said, hey, this is wrong and this is not true. And they didn't correct. So initially I had gone to the journal and asked for retraction, as did others. The journal did not do that. So then I went to the University of Toronto and I asked them to investigate the researchers and to retract the study. And I went back and forth several times. I actually did try to convince them to change their mind, gave them a full critique of the paper and the actual words used that were problematic and fraudulent in the paper, right? And then they just closed the file. So then I went to the funding agency because it was federally funded, and the study was waved around in Parliament to justify travel restrictions, extending the travel restrictions. And I asked them to correct the record and to investigate the university and the researchers. And when they voted not to do that, when the president of CIHR, NSERC, and SSHRC voted to do nothing and to let the false record stand, then I went to the OPP. Because at that time I had started looking more into the conflicts of interest, and there looked like there was a lot of evidence for a police investigation. So I wrote a 150-page evidentiary report and sent it to the OPP, the anti-rackets branch of the OPP. And I did give Premier Ford's office a copy. So I sent him a letter as well. All right. All I said in that letter is I asked him to support an investigation by the OPP, but I've never heard back from Ford's office.
So just for everybody, the OPP is the Ontario Provincial Police Service.
Yes, thank you.
And they, all of Ontario is their jurisdiction. And so you also asked Ford for comment or support for this investigation. You've never heard back from the Premier or his office on that letter? No,
I've never heard back.
Maybe you have time. Maybe they lost. Maybe it's under a couple of sheets of paper and they need to look for it. Maybe you should remind the Premier Doug Ford that it's not just a gravy train that's important, and he should respond to people. But what did OPP Commissioner Carrick, did he respond to you? So
I sent a letter to him personally. I did address it to Carrick, okay? But I got a call from an intake officer, and it's the intake officer scheduled an interview. Yep. So I had an interview. It seemed pretty... I've never had an interview with the OPP before. But,
I have.
But it seemed pretty routine. Why did you write it? What did you find? They looked a lot into my motives, and we discussed the evidence, and I talked about the need for an investigation. We didn't see eye to eye on a few things, but it was very cordial. And what we didn't see eye to eye on, I said that, I'd like to get back to him in a week or two, that I would consult, a lawyer and some case law to better support my position, because I did have some, but we didn't see eye to eye on, for example, when I looked at what was going on in the province, it seemed that this kind of study was being used for extortion, basically, to get people to do things they didn't want to do. And I was also looking at scientific fraud, but also this was using federal funding, misusing federal funding. So I wanted the OPP to investigate these things. All right. But the intake officer, for example, said, extortion has to be threat of violence. And I said, well, no, because blackmail is covered with extortion, and like putting nudie pictures of somebody on the internet, for example, is an obvious one, and there's no violence there, right? And he argued with that, and I said, okay, well, that's okay. Remember, I went to the OPP because I wanted an investigation. So I wanted us to be kind of on the same team.
But just be certain you were asking them to investigate a fraud.
I was asking him to investigate several things.
Okay.
All right. So, and I'm very clear, like when I write my book, I talk a lot about the scientific fraud because this is a textbook definition. And so I use business fraud, Canadian hates science. So it's in a scientific fraud context. When I go to the OPP, I'm asking for a broader investigation, right? Not just scientific fraud, but I'm looking, it was the anti-rackets branch. So I'm looking at CIHR, and I'm looking at University of Toronto, CMAJ, and the researchers. And I'm saying something bigger is going on here. And then I give my perspective of what I was hoping they would investigate. So that it was being used as a tool for extortion is one thing, right? That there was public funds that were being misused is another thing. But when it comes to those things, that's the area for the OPP. So I'm very careful.
So did you ever hear back from these, you call them an intake officer. These people ought to be detectives. Like that's who does
the detective sergeant.
Yes, right on. Because when I've done that, trying to expose corruption in politics, I've had those discussions with the OPP and the rackets people as well. So did you hear back from them? Did they call you back up and say, well, Gina, we need more evidence along this line, or we need more evidence that proves this before we can... Did they do anything like that?
Okay, so there was some red flags in the initial interview, and I do go through that in this book, where there was resistance right away. For one of the things that struck me was one of the first things that the detective sergeant said was that he was quadruple vaxxed. And I never asked for his vaccine status. And he didn't need to tell me his vaccine status, but yet he felt he should and did. So that it tells me something when he gives that information. And then also when he goes back and he says, I had no problem with what the government did. Again, that's beside the point. And then he also made remarks as to, his personal opinion of what the government did. And I said, but I'm not asking you to investigate the government. I'm asking you to investigate this specific case of scientific fraud and how it's being used to get people to do things that
they otherwise would not do.
Yes, it's deception and it's harming individuals. And I mentioned him being a doctor and his professional obligations, and I mentioned the funds, and there's several things I wanted to investigate.
If you don't mind, when was that discussion approximately?
It was interesting because Visman had done his study on August 25th, 2022. And then I had written all those letters to the OPP, and the actual day of my first interview was the 1-year anniversary of this study.
Okay.
So it was April 25th, 2023.
And so going back again, did they follow up afterwards and say, Gina, let's see if we can drill down in here and find something else that proves this point or proves that point?
So because we didn't see eye to eye on certain things in terms of the extortion and the fraud, I left it as I'm going to come back with some case law, and I'm going to also talk to a couple of lawyers and get back to you, right? And at that time, I said, 1 to 2 weeks, and a few days after, and then I sent him an email right after to summarize the points that we had talked about, and also the points where there was some disagreement, and that I would be coming back to him with more evidence or that type of thing. And I talked to I ended up talking to a lawyer, and I also ended up talking to a retired OPP officer, and I talked to the OPP officer, the retired OPP officer, because I wanted to figure out if there was a way to I wanted to have an amicable relationship with the OPP. It wasn't contentious. It wasn't pointing my finger at them. It was like, I'm trying to
lodging a complaint should not be contentious.
No, but I wanted to make sure that it was like how do I approach this so that I can facilitate action, like an investigation. I'm just asking for an investigation. So I got a few pointers, but he wasn't too optimistic. And he was right. The disappointing thing is when I got back to the intake officer, the detective sergeant, and said, okay, how about next, I think it was a Wednesday, but I'll check my notes. I have the dates in there. I said, how about that day? And he said, sure, no, that'd be great. And I wanted to make sure that I gave him enough notice because I wanted to keep it open. I didn't want it closed before I got back to him, which is why when I got back to him and I started talking about, the case law that I have gathered, and especially the points where we didn't agree. And he cut me off right away and said, no, we have already closed this case. We got together right before, and he knew we were going to talk, and they decided to close it. And I thought, why would you do that? You knew we were going to have this discussion, and you guys
closed the case before
we even get back.
Yeah.
And then the first session, the first interview seemed, fairly cordial, and it was taped, and it seemed fairly routine. I mean, there was some points of disagreement, but it was okay. The second one was very defensive. He comes back and basically, I don't know what happened, but he really, I felt it was more hostile.
Yep.
And came back with, well, I never seen any issues and I don't have a problem. And I'm like, well, it's not about you. Right?
Well, I like, this is important because that also illustrates to me just another example of how our institutions protect the power structures that we have. The institutions, although they're originally designed and created to protect the public's interest, they have become detrimental to the public interest, in my view, and not only self-serving, but protect the benefits that they derive from the power system, from the political system. So whether it's the hospitals, whether it's the universities and public health departments, or whether it's the OPP or whoever,
right?
Even the library board wouldn't allow you in if you weren't chat. Like, it was every institution. But I also, I want to wrap this up in a moment, but in October of 2021, to me, there was already such overwhelming evidence documented of vaccine adverse injuries being reported and fatalities. I sent a letter to the OPP.
Oh, did you? Okay.
Requesting a criminal investigation into what is causing all these deaths, and pointing the finger specifically at the vaccine as Thomas Creek, once again, I don't know if he ever responded directly to you. He responded to me and he said, well, I sent it over to the coroner's department, but of course the coroner won't investigate unless some police authority tells them to. Yeah. So we got into the circle jerk, the institutional circle jerk with the OPP. But why I bring this up, and I think this is something, everybody's always looking for, what else can we do? And that may be both an interesting one, an access to information request, to see how many letters were sent to the OPP requiring or requesting an investigation into the adverse injuries, the scientific fraud. And see, that would be a powerful. How many others like you and I were there who were requesting the OPP to launch a criminal investigation? And that could be a very foundational piece of evidence to go forward and lay a private information with a justice of the peace for a criminal investigation. If how many others were out there? Well, so if I'm not going to do, I've got my mittens full with the force right at the moment, and I don't know how busy you are, but I think that would be something, a wonderful undertaking for somebody to do, is find out how many requests for criminal investigations went unactioned. Right.
And also other things, for example, with this fraudulent study, I know there were dozens of scientists who wrote to the journal.
Yeah.
How many?
Yeah.
And how about the University of Toronto?
Yeah.
And how about CIHR, who funded it? It would be interesting to know how many did complain.
Yeah.
And then I was talking to another fellow, after I've written this book, I've had several different independent individuals who are associated either with police or former retired or still in service, reaching out to me and asking me questions. And one fellow mentioned that he knew others that had gone to the police station to launch complaints with regards to COVID, but they couldn't because there was no form or there was no mechanism. So they wanted to complain, but then there was no complaint filed.
So that would be a little bit bigger undertaking, but it's an undertaking that each person can do in their own community. Because I don't know how many municipal police forces, but each one of them would be a separate access to information request.
Right.
And
but if it's not filed, there will be no record, right?
Well, no, it would be, you'd have to, what do they have on record that is accessible? So emails would certainly be a record that they would, but each municipal force, and of course the OPP, I think would be a wonderful and enlightening activity. So, but with that,
well, I just want to. So the main thing here with this is that why this study is important is it does establish a textbook case of fraud, but also that there was the establishment was complicit, and so they knew it. So there's no wiggle room here. Yeah. And they still haven't retracted this study. Yeah. And Fisman himself is now in the lead for modeling future pandemics. Yeah. So there has been he hasn't been investigated, but not only that, but he's set to lead the way for future pandemics. And he is still pumping out full science. Yeah. He just gave one again a couple of weeks ago on this one on masking. So
David Fisman, the Bernie Madoff in Canada of COVID, with his con job and fraud. Listen, Geena, thank you very much for taking this time to chat. If you haven't got a copy of Fisman's Fraud, make sure you get it. I'm sure it's available on Amazon and Chapters and various places. And
Veterans for Freedom also has it.
Okay. And listen, I want to thank you for being here. If at the camp, we're going to take a break now and maybe have a cold beverage. And
sounds good.
And for anybody else, if you want to help out, go to nomorlockdowns.ca. You're also on Twitter and Facebook, or tell me what.
Twitter is the best, and it's at Geenawateel.
Okay. And what about Substack?
I was doing Substack, but then I turned all my intention into actually writing the books, The Accomplices, and I'm actually looking at some other... This is an obvious case of fraud, but there's been other acts by trusted individuals and organizations that have fudged the data that I'm working on.
Fisman's not the only fraud.
No, but he is an important one.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. He is one of the spiders who spun the web of deceit and it captured so many of us in this con. More like a Black Widow, Mr. Fistman. But anyway, so join me at nomorelockdowns.ca. I'm also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and all those things. And now I have a Substack account, too, which I'm trying to figure out how to use. So thanks once again. Thank you, Geena.
Thank you, Randy.
We'll chat again.
All right. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Right.
Okay.
Let's see. Hopefully my battery didn't die. It looks like we're good.
We're good?